This video is going to talk a little bit about trauma. What is trauma and what symptoms people experience when they've had a trauma? Can talk a little bit about how can you use your helping skills and caring skills to help someone as they tell you about their trauma narrative. And finally, how we can take care of ourselves when we care for others so that we can address feeling vulnerable in the face of their trauma story. It started as a normal day in 2019. I'd come home early from work and was texting my husband to make plans for the evening. And he started texting me that one of his coworkers had a firefighter family member, and that person was saying there was a shooter in the complex where he worked. But he couldn't hear or see anything, and we wondered if maybe it wasn't even true. We kept messaging each other and waiting to see. And then the police were swarming outside his office and people were running. There were people in the parking lot outside his office, and he went out to encourage them to come inside, and they barricaded the door. As he waited, we used dark humor to mask our fear and uncertainty because we couldn't hear gunshots and nothing could be seen. Well, this is how we were coping with the event. And then they sent everybody home. It was only after he got home that the mayor announced on television that 12 people had died that day. 4 had been injured, and the disgruntled employee shooter was also dead. God was good to spare my husband's life and to bring comfort to him and so many others that worked in that government complex in the months that followed them. Still, it was a traumatic event for thousands of people that worked there. And traumatic events like this happen all over the world, all the time. So many people have experienced a trauma in their lives. Throughout the Bible, people have experienced all kinds of trials and traumatic experiences. Maybe you can think of Job or Elijah or Mary, the mother of Jesus. They all had traumatic experiences. When Jesus' good friend Lazarus died, the Bible says that Jesus wept in response. And that's not just a few stoic tears, that's deep sadness and weeping. When dying on the cross, Jesus referenced Psalm 22 to ask why God had forsaken him. Strong emotional responses to horrible events are the right response. Maybe you have had a friend or family member who's experienced a traumatic event, or maybe you have experienced a trauma yourself. We want you to feel equipped to understand what trauma is, how people often respond to traumatic events, and how to come alongside a friend who is going through or has gone through a traumatic experience. There's been a lot of discussion about what trauma is in America today, so let's make sure we start out with a good definition of what trauma is. Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event or series of events, like an accident, crime, natural disaster, physical or emotional abuse, neglect, experiencing or witnessing violence, death of a loved one, war, and other things. Trauma can cause physical damage and emotional damage, and this leads to changes in the way that a person thinks and experiences their life. Now, there are different types of trauma. We're going to walk through them. The first one is acute trauma, and it tends to be something that happens in a shorter amount of time, but affects the person deeply. It can include things like violent or sexual assault, death or suicide of someone close, life-threatening illness or injury, witnessing of violence, crime, natural disaster, a distressing childbirth. All of these things and others can lead to trauma. Complex trauma is often a result of an ongoing relationship or a circumstance that the person is stuck in, and it usually happens over time. Things that cause complex trauma tend to be domestic violence, war, childhood abuse or neglect, bullying, emotional, physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, religious trauma, terrible childhood experiences, and mistreatment due to homelessness or poverty. A third type of trauma is chronic trauma. This can sometimes be a confusing type of trauma because you might listen to someone tell you a story about a life event, and the one event doesn't seem like it would initiate a traumatic event for most people. But what is missing is the chronic nature of the trauma. So maybe a friend tells you about a parent who was punishing them for breaking a rule in the household. This could happen in any family. But if a child is frequently and harshly punished for small rule breaking, then this can actually lead to a trauma. The same thing can happen with bullying, controlling behaviors, racial, ethnic, or gender prejudicial treatment, or other types of harm. Some people think that trauma can not happen to children, only to adults, but it's important to remember that trauma can happen at any age throughout the entire lifespan. Now, we've covered some different types of traumas and common causes, so let's look at what the effects of trauma are on people. Anyone who's experiencing a trauma will likely have some symptoms for about a month after an acute event, and many have symptoms much longer. The symptoms that you might hear from a friend who's gone through this include nightmares, difficulty falling or staying asleep, unpredictable emotions, and emotional reactivity, which means strong emotional reactions, especially to things that remind the person of the trauma or make them feel out of control. Not wanting to think or talk about the trauma, irritability, difficulty concentrating, anxiety and depression, dissociation, and physical symptoms, even like nausea or headaches. When these symptoms last for months or longer and interfere with the ability to live their life, then it's possible the person could be diagnosed with post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. In this case, the person's brain may actually be changed pretty significantly. Now that we've covered some of the experiences of symptoms that people have, let's talk a little bit about how to be helpful to someone who has experienced a trauma. Most people find it comforting if they have a friend who is aware of what they've been through and cares about them. Even if that friend doesn't fully understand everything about the experience or understand the symptoms that their friend is experiencing, we all want to be seen and heard. So, there are a few things to consider so that you can communicate seeing and hearing. One, if a friend or someone you're ministering to at your church starts to tell you about a traumatic type of event, it's really crucial to understand how deeply vulnerable that story is. It's good to listen well with your caring listening skills. Your attention and listening brings comfort. It may feel like you need to do more for them because the story is so distressing, but your role is to be loving and caring, to be a witness and a listener. Do not underestimate the importance of just being present. It's generally best if someone is sharing a story with trauma involved that it's done one on one and in a safe environment. Responding with love and compassion is important. I'm sure you're going to want to be responding well and you would not laugh at them or minimize their pain. But not everyone responds well to trauma stories. So if someone starts to tell a story, consider who else is around and if the room is safe. If you need to, you can pull the person aside if you perceive that the surroundings are going to be unsafe for the story that they're telling you. When someone tells you a story with a trauma involved in it, it can be tempting to share a story of your own about a similar kind of pain. We recommend that you hold off on sharing your own story at that time. You may be trying to help them feel better, but it will be best and will help them feel best if you keep the focus on their story for now so that you don't pull attention away from their story and put it onto yours. If someone just shares part of their story and they seem reluctant to share more of it, honor that. You never want to pressure someone into telling a traumatic story. It's important that they are in control of when, where, and how they tell their own story. God already knows the whole story, and we can pray for them and care for them without knowing everything. You can tell them how much you honor their experience and story of what happened to them. You might even ask them at the end of their story time, telling time, if they are feeling vulnerable or angry or have any other emotions right now in the moment after sharing that story. After sharing the story, some people have a decrease in their trauma symptoms while others have an increase in symptoms. You could let your friend know that they may feel relief from sharing their story with you, but they also might find that old memories pop up and symptoms increase, and this is normal. If traumatic symptoms have lasted for months after an acute trauma or have flared up again after a chronic or complex trauma, then they might have PTSD. Post traumatic stress disorder can become a chronic mental health problem. A referral to a medical doctor and professional therapist is a good idea. There is a window of opportunity to treat PTSD that is much better if someone seeks it out and engages sooner than if they wait for months or years and just kind of stuff those trauma symptoms down. Sometimes there are physical symptoms where a medical doctor can really help them, and you can play an important role in encouraging your friend to find a therapist who is knowledgeable about trauma. Sometimes when people have been through a traumatic experience, they will engage in coping behaviors that aren't healthy. Some people will drink too much or use drugs when their emotions are too high, or they'll engage in other kinds of unhealthy behaviors in an attempt to soothe themselves. It's important for us to remember that the person is in pain and they're trying to survive this. Judgment is unlikely to change their path. It's best if you can be loving and encouraging while also pointing them to resources to help with the unhealthy behaviors, such as therapy or a 12-step support group in your community. If a friend is engaging in unhealthy behaviors, this is a sign that professional help is likely needed, and they shouldn't just be relying on peer counseling or peer caring only. Follow up can be important with trauma, as the experience can change for the person over time. If your ministry role allows you to follow up over time with your friends, it's a good idea to offer that longer term support and care. You shouldn't cross boundaries or take on the role of their mother or their therapist, but you can care as a friend, and that can make a difference in their life. You can just be a good friend and a good listener. If the trauma happened on a certain date, then the person may have stronger feelings on the anniversary of that event. You might ask when it happened, and you might offer to get together or send an encouraging card or texts, depending on your usual way of communicating. You can offer to pray. It can be deeply meaningful in the anniversary of a tragedy to have someone else who also remembers it with them. We would like to remind you of our teaching on theology and suffering. Theodicy is a theological word that means the theology of suffering, and trauma will often cause a questioning of your theodicy. Maybe you might even need to develop a stronger, thicker, more enduring theodicy than what you have been taught so far. You might wonder, where is God when it hurts? Or how can God allow so much suffering? Your church might have some specific teachings on this as well, and you could ask a church leader for any readings, resources, or conversations on this topic. You can review our brief teaching in the Theology of Suffering in this training series. We also recommend a good book called Where is God When It Hurts by Philip Yancey. We would like to show a little care for you right now because sometimes when you've heard a terrible story, it can affect you as the carer. Hearing someone's story of trauma can be really distressing when you're the listener. You might find yourself affected by the traumatic story that someone else has experienced. This is more likely if that story is similar to something you have experienced in the past, and if you are repeatedly exposed to traumatic stories, or if you are personally in a vulnerable emotional time in your life. If you are feeling burnout or feel like the resources that you have aren't enough for the needs of others, it's time for you to consult with your church leader. It's okay for you to limit the peer caring and helping you provide. Really. You don't have to be a peer helper and carer for everyone. For example, if you yourself were sexually assaulted in childhood and you hear a story about sexual assault of a child, then it might be especially difficult for you. If that happens, you can choose to do a few things. You can set boundaries. You can let the person know that something like their story has happened to you or someone very close to you, or maybe that you're vulnerable around that topic. And it's hard for you to talk about it sometimes. Offer to talk with your church leader for some advice, but you might find someone else on the ministry team who is better able to help that person in the future. It's okay to say no to trauma related peer helping ministry in a kind and caring way. You don't have to help everyone all the time. You can communicate with your church leader. If you know you have a particular experience that's traumatic and would rather not be matched with someone in your ongoing ministry who has a story like that to tell, talk with your church leader about ways that you guys can manage that. You can share your stuff instead of stuffing it, right? You can talk with another peer helper yourself. You can talk to a professional counselor or therapist, and you can talk to a church leader about the vulnerable feelings that you're experiencing. It is important to not just stuff those feelings down and soldier on. Sharing your experience of hearing the story and how it affected you, that can actually build resilience in you. You can also surrender to God. Bring your tears and pain to God. Share your pain about your friend's story and lean on God's grace, love, and understanding yourself. If you find this difficult to do, your peer helper, counselor, or church leader can help you. But God has been present and comforting in the trauma of Christians throughout history, and He will do that with you and the people that you minister to. The World Health Organization estimates that about 70% of the world's population will experience a trauma in their lifetime. That means that most of the people in your church have or will experience a trauma. People often and usually find natural ways to not stuff it, but talk about the experience, to come to terms with it. And that's largely what the care ministry is all about, is to give people a place to do that. But some people do become overwhelmed with too much stress and too much anxiety over what's happened to them. As you minister to others in your role in care ministry, we hope that this training has helped you to be more informed and more equipped to care for those that have experienced trauma.